Hey, my ADHD family, welcome to another episode of ADHD Love Parent Talk, where we talk about all things ADHD. Today, I have my guest, Katherine. We actually are going to be talking about her ADHD journey, and then we are going to get into her organization, Pink Concussions. I think this is a very important topic. It's a topic that has been coming up quite a bit, so I thought she would be a perfect person to actually walk us through this path. So, Katherine, welcome. I'm so excited that you came on.
I'm so excited to be here, and I haven't yet in this format talked about my ADHD journey. So I'm really excited to share with you.
Oh, that's awesome. So please tell the audience a little bit about yourself.
I am 54. I live in Norwalk, Connecticut, about an hour drive or a train from New York City. I am single, divorced 10 years after being with my ex-husband for about 24 years. We have 3 children, twins that are now 24. One was diagnosed with ADHD at the age in first grade. His twin brother was not. And then one is now 21. He was born 2 years younger. So I had 3 children in 2 years, not really recommended, but I didn't do anything else but totally try to keep them alive the first couple of years.
Right.
You know?
That's funny.
We did not do daily baths. We did wash downs. So it very much fit my pattern. I was a social worker, not a licensed clinical one, but I was a social worker up until the time they were born.
Okay.
And I'd worked with trauma, PTSD, adoption, the adoption triad, and had a very ill mother and was guardian for her. So actually to be able to stay home initially with these 3 moving creatures was really great. That part I didn't struggle with. Where I first really hit my struggle was when having to get these 3 creatures to school on time with the right papers.
Yeah.
So that's kind of where the I think my initial struggles really kind of kicked in.
Okay. All right. And then just tell us, let's grow into that ADHD journey. So talk about what made you even think that you had ADHD and what made you decide to go ahead and get tested?
In 8th grade, I'd had trouble once I got to 4th and 5th grade, I had a lot of trouble in school. And my mother's not alive, so I can't really pull out, it would have been very interesting to talk to her about this, but I was not interested in the topic while she was alive. But I struggled in school, but was very bright, that kind of mismatched. I was very good at arts. The teachers would have me do bulletin boards rather than sit in class, or maybe I couldn't sit in class. I don't know. I did a lot of bulletin boards. I was very good with colored construction.
Right.
I was a pro. And then my mom, I remember being pulled out of school and suddenly arriving at a private school that had 5 to 8 kids in a classroom. And it was in an old house that had like each of the rooms had fireplaces in them. So it was really a small environment. I did much better there and worked really hard. And by 8th grade, they were testing me because I was smart. But as a kid, you're like, you're testing me. And the term I pulled out of that was dyslexia. That's what they pulled out. And I didn't find out until I was 40 after my diagnosis that at that point, the school had asked me to leave. And my mother, who had taught underprivileged and labeled in the 60s, whatever they were labeled in the Philadelphia and Boston school systems, she had kind of been the underdog for a bunch of kids as a teacher. So my mom hit them full force. So they couldn't extract me out, but I kind of stayed it was definitely under protest of the teachers. Graduate worked really hard, 4 or 5 hours of homework every night. And I thought everybody else was doing the same. I don't think I emerged socially till I was probably a senior in high school. And then college was really hard without my mom to read my papers. But I got through, and I had already been to graduate school. I learned if I liked the topic, I would do well in it. And if drop period for me was going to as many classes as I could, looking at the syllabus, looking what the expectations were. There was this really cool class I remember wanted to take on Egyptian history, but I walked in and I saw the format wasn't for me.
Okay.
So I really would run around and move so I was good at picking out what I could be successful at. And I was interested in South African history at the time, divestment, apartheid, Nelson Mandela. Those were all big themes when I was in school and important to me. So I did a minor in South African history because it was fascinating to me. So the boys start school and suddenly we can't wander around in the morning in our PJs for 2 hours because they want to, or be at the playground at 5 a.m. in the morning because they can't sleep. We had to be there at a certain time with all these pieces. It's like camping, when you're taking children to school. Right. And I was privileged enough to stay home at the time. So I didn't have, and they had a number of health issues, but I still had trouble lining all those balls up. And it was first grade where they called out that my son was really, there were issues. So we had him tested.
Okay.
That result came back and it was a 15-page document. And a lot of it in retrospect, I realized is cut and paste ADHD. He had ADHD and dyslexia, but I read the profile and thought, this is either me or I psychologically have just mapped myself to my son's issues and I need therapy. So I went to the neuropsych, who we had just paid $4,500 for this, and said, I need you to test me because I either need some deep therapy or this is me. And he hemmed and hawed. And I just said, I can't parent until you figure out if I'm intuitive or crazy. And so he did it. And he came back and said that my score, he hadn't seen yet a parent child have such similar scores.
Wow.
We both went on meds around the same time. And my son would go to the nurse, and at the time she was checking his pulse, which probably made him nervous to go to the nurse every couple hours. So his pulse was high. So we turned it off. We stopped taking the medication, but I never told the teachers that he stopped taking medication. So everyone was prepared. He was taking medication. He took it for a day. He never took it again. I take the medication for 2 months, and then I go in to meet with the teachers. They're like, he is doing so much better on medication. He is we see so many differences in him, and he wasn't on medications. I was on medications. They're like, he's so organized. He has all his homework. Wow. So I tell that story because I think a lot of the time starting out medicating the parents might help. And I can say that I'm not sure what leeway the neuropsychs have to say, hey, apple doesn't fall far from the tree.
Right.
So when I went back to the neuropsych, I said, look, my son's doing so much better because I'm on medication. Isn't that great? And he was actually angry at me. He's like, so if your child was a diabetic, would you not give him his medication? Like, I got no credit. There's no credit given. He was like, great. So you're still keeping this from your child. So my son started medication. We were both on Strattera, which is non-stimulant. And he stayed on it till his senior year in high school. I am still on it. I've taken a couple of months off. And I think it was a great benefit. His father and I had divorced by that time, and his dad really hated he was on meds and really put a lot of pressure of him to come off. He's still off today. I see some stuff that he struggles, but he's of my 3 kids, the one that in first grade that we thought, will he ever live home and live independently? And we have this kid on meds, and it was a dark, rainy night. We were driving home from a late night, 7 o'clock doctor's appointment. We're so depressed. And that was the kid that went to Fordham. His freshman year was so organized. He sat in the library with 3 other kids and tutored them for $20 an hour while he was doing his homework. So he made $60 an hour. He ended up having private clients, kids who had wealthy parents who, dad would write a check for the week and my son would help. Then he, by his sophomore summer, got a job working at a large investment firm as an intern. He made $30,000 a year, sophomore, junior, senior year. he would, when he wasn't in school, he was in a suit, and he would get on the train in the South Bronx and go to Midtown, or he'd go, I mean, he worked really hard, but he was always used to working hard. He's like, what am I going to do, Mom? Hang around in the dorm?
Right.
Like, so he made money, and then he graduated a semester early, was hired by that firm, and is such a hard worker that anytime actually a woman goes on maternity leave, he jumps into their slot, and he has now progressed. So
that's amazing.
2.5 years out of college, he's paid off all his college. He's bought his own car. He has his own apartment. He is the most launched of my children. And yet at first grade, he was the one with the multiple diagnoses that were like, he'll never live at home. And I think I've watched the other two face adversarial. They all face adversarial, whether it's a concussion or an assault or a loss of a friend or mental. I mean, like, they all suffer something. I thought as a parent, we could protect them at least till they were 21. The one that had the ADHD and just got that early life lesson, it's going to be harder for you. You have to dig in and work hard. He is the one that's the most resilient.
That is amazing. And that's really hope for a lot of parents who worry about the same exact things. So when you both were diagnosed, what types were you guys diagnosed with?
It was 17 years ago. I think both ADHD. And I definitely, we also, both his dad and I are sober at this point about 30 years. So we were sober about 15 years when the kids were born, maybe 10 years when the kids were born. We knew addiction was a part of our bloodline.
Okay.
And there really aren't charts when two alcoholics or addicts create children. The chart is like one parent with substance abuse disorder.
Gotcha.
Is a 50 chance. And when I've asked, what if both parents, what if two alcoholics marry and have kids? What's that? And they're like, I don't know, it's off the charts. So we were kind of monitoring them to see addictive behaviors. That was more of our focus in those years, to see who. So I remember my mother-in-law saying to me when he was about 3, I hope you're not thinking of putting him on Ritalin. It's like, what are you, it's just kind of like one of those mother-in-law comments. Like, I'll say something nice, but I'll launch a little grenade. So obviously other people knew of his motion, but I was the parent that I went and did all the field trips. And we went through a period of time where we had, it was short, but we had the app while they were in elementary school. We had the funds that I could stay home.
Okay.
And in those 4 or 5 years, I did all the field trips. And they would always give me like the 8 boys that nobody else wanted. And we'd do the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City. I would have them through in an hour. We would like zip through, and we'd be out on the playground. And
you knew how to deal with it. You knew how to handle the kids.
I literally, and before the kids were born, there were a group of young boys in our neighborhood. They were about 12, and we were about 25, 26, and we were interested in children, but none of our friends had any. And so we kind of adopted these 3 boys that were all from different households. And I thought I was just the miraculous social worker. I would cook with them. We took them skiing. I was, it was just because I shared the same diagnosis. Right. So if I look back, my very successful interventions were just mutual hangouts, right?
Right. Right. That's too funny.
So it's hard. It's hard for me to see my sons. I could see when he was struggling, but it was hard to see. I could see why the system didn't fit him.
I see.
And like his reward for attending to whatever he had to do, he didn't want a sticker. He wanted to walk out in nature. So he got to do a walk around the school if he did whatever he was supposed to. It was more lenient time. School doors were open and you could walk outside.
Right.
I really feel for kids now with new school rules that, parents can't come into the classroom and everything's a lot more locked down. But yeah, and there was a girl in his class and I'm like, just follow Brooke, do whatever Brooke does. If Brooke gets pencils, you get pencils. So I would try to give him suggestions. And anytime I brought suggestions from the neuropsych or my reading, and I have a friend that worked with ADHD children, and she would give me, I would say, could you adapt this certain ruler with the alphabet in a way on the kid's desk? The teacher would say, that's a great idea. Let's do that for everyone.
Yeah, it is. It is. And it's really interesting that you talk about that, because I remember a time when I was sharing with somebody else when I took my child to camp. And in the beginning, they didn't even want to read the rules, right? Even though they said that accept ADHD children, they didn't even want to read them. And then so they had a very rough week with him, to say the least. And so after having a very long, detailed conversation with them, they did look at that list. They not only read the list, they used a lot of those techniques for the other children. And that's what people don't realize, is that a lot of the things that they do works for other kids and really should be in practice for other children. So
I can't think of one intervention that I ever brought into the classroom that the teacher didn't say that's a great idea, from binders with, organize your work. And I had the time then to be in the classroom. I was telling my son this the other day. What I would do is go in the morning, drop the kids off, make that transition, because you could say hi to the teachers, and then I would go Xerox for an hour. I would pick up whatever they had to Xerox for the 3 teachers. I'd spend an hour at the Xerox machine, because I knew if I did that, those teachers would, instead of would either get a lunch or a coffee break or do something else rather than this manual copying. I could copy. So I really tried to, when trainings came in for my son, I tried to incorporate them and buy the book for the teacher so she could, provide all of the skills. Orton Gillingham had been for dyslexia years before, when my father had been superintendent in that school, but it had gotten out of, they would lost practice, things change.
Right.
So, so that was really, I put a lot of energy in to being there. And I had the time and the privilege to do that. When they were in middle school and high school, not so much, but by that point they had really, my son had really had the skills, and it was hard. I mean, we picked him up and in the middle of the day, and he went to see a tutor 45 minutes away. He missed birthday parties. He missed things, but and I always would explain to him, I'm like, I like the hunter farmer. We said he was he was a hunter, and my son, his twin brother, was a farmer. And I said, we're in a farmer's world. So to fit into the farmer's world, you need a tutor, medication, and adjusting our behaviors to fit in the rule of the land, which is theirs. If we lived in a rainforest, your brother would be in a tutor taking medications and having adaptive strategies taught to him, because he wouldn't survive in a forest for about 5 minutes. But you, with the hunter brain, and so I discussed the pros and cons of each, or the strengths and limitations of each one. So I just said, it happens to be the time that we lived. If we lived in a sailing village 200 years ago, you'd be a cabin boy out on the, we lived in the, in the West, you would be riding horses every day. So we're not, you don't match the particular skill set that they're looking for right now in this time in your life. So we're helping you along, but it's not anything wrong with you. It's just a mismatch between your environment and your skill set.
No, I like that. And you're actually sharing a lot of gems, through this. But one of the things that you guys are doing, or that you did, was meet them exactly where each of your child was, right? So you really taught them the techniques to help them be successful. And that is so important, is understanding your child.
And it's hard when they're twins, because they were, I tried to raise them that, you always have your brother's back, and, family comes first. And, they were very different. They were, night and day different. And, the one with ADHD would cry and was very emotional, and would get upset about things. Social justice was so important for him. And if somebody was stealing there were 2 girls, and one would steal the other, or one would negotiate and take the other one's popcorn every day. And my son felt like it was wrong. And it got to the point where the teacher's like, if you get up to negotiate this conflict between these two girls, you will be in trouble. You cannot, you cannot stick up for the younger or the underdog in this situation. But I mean, just kill my son. He's like, she's so mean to her. I gotta.
Yeah.
And eventually the crowd kind of turned on him, and I know that his brother struggled whether to step in, but if 6 kids are teasing your brother, and you're looking at your brother crying in 3rd grade, it's not like you're an 8th grader, you're the same age, right? So I think they did. And I remember once the non-ADD twins said to the other one, well, you're in special ed and I'm in academically talented, and I was driving the car. I drove them right to the school and I dumped them off at the social worker. And I go, resolve this between them. And it was interesting because all my boys started out in special ed. Even the one without ADHD, he had he had speech issues.
Okay.
So they all started out in special ed, and then they all were in special ed and then took oral exams to get into the academically talented. So I had both ends of the spectrum, Yeah. So it was this just cross section of, of children in both ends. And there were some people that felt that that I had 3 children in academically talented, which I think is so terribly named. And that I had 3 children in there, and then that must be, some privilege that I had because they probably,
all 3 of them.
Yeah, and they obviously been in special ed, so the whole mother track was. I still want to go back to elementary school and just say that whole academically talented thing is just. So we would go in and we would teach the other talented, and a whole other thing about that. And it was great that there was academically talented, but I always thought that the ADHD kids, and I know that there's a couple of groups that do this now, do an inventor program. The kids that don't get in that. And it's generally the kids that aren't academically talented. They're the ones that need the enrichment.
Right. No, I agree with that. Yeah, I do agree with that. So let me ask you, so if parents are trying to decide, so 2 things, if parents are trying to decide to get their children diagnosed, or they're trying to decide to get themselves diagnosed, what would your recommendation be? Because people are going back and forth. Some don't believe in the diagnosis. Some are afraid of the stigma. But what would your advice be if they're trying to decide for themselves or for their children whether to get diagnosed or not, or to get tested or not?
So I'm still learning from a point of cultural humility about a diagnosis if you're a child of color. And I do believe in systemic racism, and I do believe that there are biases. And so I don't know that piece, but as far as a parent, getting a 15-page document on my child was incredibly important, and it was incredibly expensive. They were about $4,000. I think we found someone that was more like $2,000, and then insurance gave us maybe some portion back, but doing it was always a big internal conflict in the marriage because the amount of money that it would cost. But it was basically, I felt instructions to your brain. It's like, are you going to buy, well, men don't read directions in general, but are you going to buy a software, are you going to buy a microwave and not have the instructions with it, right? Yeah. I think every kid should get a neuropsych. I think it should just be a part of, hey, we're gonna do let's figure out what kind of brain you have. You have this kind of brain. It works well in this environment. It doesn't. So, and I have always gone to neuropsychs that sit down with my kids and draw pictures with them and say, hey, look, here's your brain on sleep. Here's your brain not on sleep. And if you go to college and you drink heavily on the weekends, your attention, which is average, is going to fall to below average, So all the way through from elementary school through college, our kids had neuropsychs every 5 or 6 years. We found it helpful. I think that their dad would say we spent too much money on it at a time where we ended up not having money. But it certainly was a document to get a 504, which really is essential for my kids. The testing they were allowed, at the time you couldn't get extra time with standardized, the SATs were almost impossible to get extra time, but you never know along that pathway when you're going to need that.
Right.
So the neuropsych was important to the 504, and a 504, teachers have to follow it, whether they agree with it or not. And that a lot of that stuff from high school does translate to college. So unfortunately, I think it's really important now, depending on the school district, labeling and what happens to your kid when that label goes on. I think that has to be an individual, but we always did them outside of school. We always picked the neurologist. The school did one for my son, and they said his attention was fine. And I'm like, when did you examine him? And they said, oh, in the library. And I'm like, okay, in the library. What were they doing? Yeah. And he's like, oh, they were watching a video. Like literally, you're examining, and that may have been the time that he had free, because school psychologists are doing so many things. So I wanted to control that. I knew that, my son had eaten and had slept and had gone in and was comfortable. And it wasn't like 5 different minutes, before he was supposed to go out for recess, or something like that. So again, it was expensive. And there were times where, I couldn't find anybody, and we had to wait a couple years to get reconnected. So it is a financial burden. Yeah. So that being said, getting, getting 8 hours of testing on your kids, we did it in 2 different days. The information that I found was very useful, but then in the end, it's a report, right? And if you know your kid and you can work with your teachers and work with a tutor and get those strategies implemented, and you don't need the report. I mean, it's hard to tell. I took my children to speech therapy for many years. I never did the homework with them. I hated the homework. I spent a lot of money on speech therapy. We never did the work, and a lot of it didn't work. So in the end, it's what you want to put your energy into, right? So
yeah, that makes perfect sense.
The report shouldn't go in a file. The report should be an active document that you're working on. And if you already know what your kid needs, and I think, I do these 128 questions of Ned Hollowell's every night at Clubhouse, and it's not a diagnostic test. It's not validated. There's nothing in it that is on any official test in the world, but it's 128 questions. And if you read the 128 questions, you hang out in our room a couple nights and you like it there. It's a diagnosis I think self-diagnosis has a role. Right. Now, is it going to get you a 504? Is it going to get extra times on your SATs? Is it going to get, a college disability? No. So
really the question is you really have to ask yourself, why do you need it? Or why are you looking for the diagnosis? That's the bottom line. So depending on what direction you're going to take it will determine if you get the diagnosis or not. Right.
And it is expensive. And a lot of these the neuropsychs, it's cash up front. Correct. And then they give you codes and then you send it in. So, it's very easy to say, oh yes, you should have that treatment. And I've had years where I didn't have health insurance, and stepping up to whatever medical care puts you down. So I do want to acknowledge that they are expensive. Schools sometimes will do them. Mm-hmm. And if that's the option and you can, follow along what they're doing, that's, if you can get it paid for by other institution, that's great too.
Okay. All right. So let's move into the Pink Concussions. So what made you start this nonprofit organization?
It was merely to have a place to direct parents that I thought were being kind of neglectful of their girls. And my son, the twin that did not have ADD and dyslexia, had 6 concussions in 13 months. and was really struggling. He missed most of 6th grade and part of 7th grade. And it was a profound impact on our family to have him home right at the point I was supposed to be going back to work, literally like 2 days before. And so I was home with him. And when I took him to doctors, which I was pretty comfortable in going to the medical community and advocating for my kids, they didn't have really great answers. So I had started going to concussion conferences for doctors and nurses, medical professionals, learned a bunch. The CDC had put some information out on their new program. I was running the lacrosse league at the time, so I was training our coaches with this new CDC information. And then the football team said, can you train ours? So I was pretty much doing youth sports.
Okay.
I was kind of the concussion mom. A lot of people were calling me, but I noticed this pattern that boy parents, I have 3 boys, so we didn't really interact with girls at all until this point. Once they got to be like 14, girls were all over it. At this point, they were avoiding us. I didn't know many people that had girls. But so when the boy parents would call, they would call saying, we've left the ER, we've left the mountain, this happened yesterday, this happened today, what do I do?
Okay.
And I had this 1-hour chat where I could really explain as a social worker how to live with a kid with an acute concussion. I wasn't giving medical advice, but I was giving life advice. The girl parents would call me, it's been 3 weeks and we still can't get her out of her room. Or it was 2 months ago and now she has intense headaches. And they were so out of the time zone where the boy parents were calling me. So I figured they were all neglectful. Like, I'm just like, why didn't you take your girl for care? And I do know that a study in 2012 said if you fell in the backyard, you had a 50-50 chance, and you had a possible head injury, you had a 50-50 chance of your parent taking you for medical care. If you fall in a sporting event with a crowd, with some people around, you have an 80% chance.
Gotcha.
And I think it's also, as a parent, you're like, yeah, wow, I got to take this kid, you know.
Right.
And at home, you probably didn't see it. If 5 or 6 people see your kid collide with another kid and they're asking you, there's going to be more general concern than, oh, I just fell off my bike. You know, here's an ice pack. So I got tired of it. And it was to explain to these parents so far out, it was a lot more work. And so then the patterns, like, it can't just be boy parents, girl parents. So then I started looking in the research and I found sex differences that no one was talking about. I pulled all that research together. I came up with the name Pink Concussions, put up a website because I had been building websites on the side because I couldn't get back to a day-to-day job. And I was going to refer them like, okay, you have a girl that's 2 months out, go read the research. And I got cancer, had a year sitting in chemotherapy and radiation, and thought about this and thought it should be more than a website. It should be a meeting. What if I pulled in all of these experts? So I spent the whole year planning. In 2016, I had the first international conference on female brain injury.
Nice.
But it literally started out as a website to refer parents that, you know, and these parents would come distraught, you know, she isn't the same person.
Of course.
You know, and I'm like, well, why didn't she get for care? I really very rarely, if all, had a boy in that situation. So I think.
So what type of services does Pink Concussions offer?
So we have links to research. We have videos, short 2 to 3 minute videos, which I guess would be considered like a TikTok on different topics. And we have a YouTube channel now where I interview experts. We have a domestic violence brain injury task force. And then sort of our largest catch-all is we have 14 groups on Facebook that are support groups that have you know, like a moderator. We have volunteers that check to make sure, you know, those are private groups where you can join. I think we have like 30, I think we have 8,000 across 13 or 14 groups. We have like 3,500 in the women over age 25. We have a veterans group. They're all different types of groups. You can join all of them or none of them. Some have men in them, like the caregivers group, parenting group. And it's just for peer-to-peer sharing. And they're over 3 years old now and very popular. And people find information, but generally uplifting. It's
Yeah.
building community circles. Those are all free. We don't have any component that, I mean, everything we do is free. I'm a volunteer. Anybody that helps, we have a professional advisory board. I mean, it exists because people donate their time and their expertise. So that, and it's interesting because I've identified more as somebody with a brain injury. And then when my son was born, I'm like, oh, wow, ADHD, that's, so I've moved more from brain injury determined how I interact to more ADD.
Gotcha.
But with my ADD background and my multiple concussions, I can also understand what people that have long-term persistent symptoms in brain injury have.
Mm-hmm.
The one real difference is I don't remember not being ADHD. And I did have a brain injury when I was 2. And I had always stemmed a lot of my issues on that brain injury. But then when my son was born without a brain injury, I'm like, oh,
Gotcha.
genetics.
Gotcha.
So I don't have the hindrance that many people in brain injury, where I could do this before my injury. I ran an office of 40 people. I could shop, I could do everything. And now that my TBI has happened, I cannot do those things and I'm struggling. And that differential of accepting your neurodiversity at this point versus before is really tough.
So let me ask you. So, well, the first question is, how many women, I mean, what's typical for brain injuries or for concussions for women? What do you know what the stats are about that? Because obviously a lot of it's not reported, or people are
A lot of it's not reported
to help them, but just the ones that are, is it quite a bit? Is it the same as men or different?
So overall in numbers, there's twice as much brain injury in men as there is women.
Okay.
And that number is really basically, if this is the difference in men's concussions, women's concussions, it starts out pretty much the same. And at birth and those toddler years, maybe boys are a little more adventurous. And then you get 5 to 25. And the men are up here twice as many as women. And then as you get to 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, it kind of, they align again. But that 5 to 25-year-olds point is when the men are taking risks. They do more stupid things, more access to firearms, more access to cars.
I see.
History, they, up until recently, they drank more. Now, unfortunately, the liquor industry has been really focused on increasing the amount of that women drink, especially hitting those mothers, they have pushed moms and wine. They pushed women into wine after childcare. We were trying to bring back the 1950s, 60s cocktail when you get home from work.
Right.
And they hit up the mommies. The mommies wine and wine thing, it's 5 o'clock, you deserve your glass of wine.
Yeah.
So unfortunately, we may see some shifting in that, but basically men do more stupid things. They take more risk. They have twice as much of brain injury along the lifespan. If you take those teenage years and the other ones, women also live longer at that point. And then they're alone. Mostly they tend to outlive their spouses. So there's a danger element for the women there. But let's say you take away that risk factor and that I'm going to jump from the roof to the pool, or I'm going to take my bike on the top of the playground and take away all that stuff, which my boys, and I was a girl that would follow the boys through any trees or any lake, so I was following the boys. But take like soccer, boys and girls have the same rules. You really can't go too much out of the box. The rules, if you play incredibly aggressively, you're going to get pulled for a foul. So the risk is about the same. In that situation, the girls concuss at twice the rate of boys. We have a biological variable at the cellular level that makes us more vulnerable to concussion. And we just saw that 2 years ago, the papers that came out that will show at the nanotubular, which is the tiniest cell level that we can see at this point. Women there are these strands that make up this nanotubular, and women have fewer strands and they're more slender. The men have, a thicker neuro bunching. But it also, in general, there are those are the sex, the biological differences, but there are also gender differences. Where is there an athletic trainer at the girls' volleyball game?
Okay.
Is the athletic trainer at the boys' football game? Did she drive home and study all night and then her symptoms came out the next morning? And her parents didn't think the way a boy's parents who may or may not be more aware.
Okay.
Boys have concussions in their video games, their first person shooter games. They're trying to concuss people all the time, hours and hours during the day on video games. There isn't a girl's equivalent like My Little Pretty Pony concusses the other pretty pony,
Right.
So
Different.
Dr. Christine Master at CHOP, Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, did a study last year where they showed at the ER level, girls are taken in about 4 or 5 days later than boys.
Mm.
And then they felt that girls taking longer to recover, that when they adjusted for that the boys and girls were recovering at about the same time.
Okay.
So if you give girls equal medical care, that helps their recovery. So we still have, it's hard to map one, where's there a control? There's not a control, boys to girls, and brain injury is such a fluid injury to healing to, it's hard to line all this up. But we definitely know there's sex differences, and we definitely know that there's gender differences.
So let me
and then on top of that, there's access to medical care. So, most of these studies are, sports doctors, white children of privilege that are in sporting events, or NCAA athletes. We don't know about the kids that may not have access to medical care, or their parents are working,
right.
Or, there are many reasons that children aren't taken into care. And these are all for the active ones. So you had just asked about total numbers. I think of it as an iceberg. On the top of the water are the sports, the ones you can talk about. And then below the iceberg are intimate partner violence, abuse, domestic violence, workplace violence, car accident, but you refuse medical care, but now you're home and now people think you're doing it to get, the lawsuits can be. So there's so many more. And I think we say, 2 to 3 million a year above the water line.
Wow. That's amazing. So let me ask you, so when is it truly a brain injury situation? So like, for example, I was in an accident and I had a mild concussion, but had no issues after that. So when it's truly a problem?
It's kind of smoke and mirrors.
Okay.
I'm not a neurologist. I'm generally, when somebody calls me and I talk to them, I generally, have a good idea whether they're going to be diagnosed or not.
Gotcha.
They're desperately trying to come out. There was a recent release last week of a saliva test that they used on male rugby players in the UK, that very subset group, but they felt like the saliva test correlated with whether they were concussed or not. They were looking at blood tests. Other than that though, if there's a dog lying on the ground and you're trying to decide whether it's dead or alive, you take your foot and you poke it, right? Like, can I see signs of life, right? I mean, that's kind of what they're doing with the concussion. They're like, you've come to me, you've said you had a concussion. They're always going to, you've been in a car accident. They're always going to try to see if they can invoke symptoms, with a light in your eye, with doing the saccade testing, with the, all the, they're, stand on one foot, close your eyes.
I remember all of that.
So they're trying to figure it out. So there are 2 classifications in general. There are 3. There's mild TBI, and then there's moderate and severe, and there's this Glasgow Coma scale that they use, you know, and there was at a time we looked at if you had been if you were unconscious or not, and they used to grade for second degree, first degree, you know, depending on how long you've been unconscious. That got thrown out. Bob Cantu put that in when there was nothing else to do, and it turned out not to be very valid, so they threw it out. But you know, they keep trying things. Brain injury is the unwanted stepchild of neurology. You know, the other fields, Alzheimer's and all this, like they pat us on the head, but they really don't really, I don't feel like they want us at the table, you know. So we are a new field, we're a young field, and we're learning stuff all the time. And we may not have the money or the track record that some of the bigger neurology branches have. But we're getting there. A lot of all the research was done on men.
Oh, wow.
And especially college age white men in the 50s and 60s. And then as football became more integrated, race was included. But in general, you're talking about men that are capable of playing football. So even, you know, extrapolating across you know, that's a pretty elite group of people, right? That can show up for that kind of, but you cannot bruise or damage people's brains in a laboratory. So when the brain injury doctors were looking for a place, like, where can we find brain injury? They're like, oh, football. So that's why they ended up at the football fields, because they knew brain injury was happening there.
Gotcha.
So that was, you know, the guinea pigs. And now a lot of the sports docs are interested now in studying domestic violence because, you know, the research shows that between 70 to 90% of the women in domestic violence shelters will have brain injuries too.
Okay. All right. That makes sense.
Right. And unfortunately, you look in prisons too, and male and female prison populations, you know, depending on the study, 50 to 60% of people in prison have brain injuries. So it really is this hidden part. And if you don't get help, you will the probability is that you will, for some reason, end up tangling with the law.
Okay.
And legally, I mean, and then you have systemized racism on how your brain injury is interpreted and what help you get, and the justice system.
Right.
So unfortunately, I think that brain injury, you know, for some groups and some ages ends up being a direct line to prison. So it's really important back at the beginning to get the right care and help and assistance quickly.
Yeah, makes sense.
And so your overall question, there are people that have a car accident or a sports injury and may have concussive-like symptoms. There's no scan to prove whether they did or not. They'll say you have a mild TBI, which means you don't have a severe one. You're not in the hospital with a tube down your throat.
Correct.
But it's not a mild concussion, and a mild TBI can have years of effects on your life or months of effects on your life. The only thing that makes it mild is you aren't in an ICU unit.
I see. That makes sense.
But it's a bad term because it's people are like, concussion. Yeah, you know, it's like, you know, well done or a rare steak determines, you know, how the meat is cooked, right?
Right.
And a mild TBI does not mean that it's going to be mild for you. It just means in that moment, you're not an ICU unit.
I see. All right. So my next thing is, so I read that you suffered a concussion at the age of 16, and plus having ADHD. Has the combination made your experience worse? Did you have struggles? Did it make it stronger? I mean, like, how does the combination make sense? Or how does the combination work for you?
I'm still learning about this. And again, I don't think research hasn't come up with a complete answer yet. But looking at this, ADHD is a risk factor. Learning disabilities are a risk factor for a extended recovery from a concussion.
Okay.
And I was talking to Dr. Ned Hollowell, and he sees a real connection with ADHD people either being risk-taking or impulsive and getting concussions. And so I held my first room on concussions and ADHD just from a peer perspective the other night. And so I'm still fleshing that out, but it is risk factors for having a long recovery that is difficult. And that could be, I mean, they're saying now women are about 22 to 33 days.
Okay.
And your symptoms can go away, but your balance still can be off. Your eyesight were you told not to drive for a couple of days?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So there are things where it isn't apparent until you're, jump on a skateboard. Oh, my balance isn't what I thought it was. So there's this recovery period.
Okay.
It's not like you have red spots and the red spots go away and you're fine. There can be things that are going on neurologically that take some time. So say that's 22 to 33 days. Longer than that, some of the risk factors are being a female, having someone in your family that has a migraine situation, ADD, dyslexia, learning disabilities, having a previous concussion, having vestibular issues, like you're a person that gets car sick, motion sickness. And it tends to exacerbate things that you had leading up to it. So.
And, it's really interesting because you really don't know if, to your point, you're told it is mild, but unless you really understand the symptoms, what could come out of a concussion, like I really don't know if anything, even though I just said, it sounds like my life was fine, but, I don't know if any of the situations that I had was due to the concussion. Like I've fainted a couple times in my life. And so there's little things that have happened since then, but I never thought it might be due to, it may not be, but I'm just saying in terms of, because I just don't have that education. So.
Right. And there are people that get concussed and, 2-3 days, there's a family that literally every time they get a concussion, they're fine in like 3 days. And that in my family, we're out for months at a time.
Gotcha.
So there are genetic predispositions for things. In particular families, there are genetic codes, there's, stress factors, is the family going through a divorce at the time? Has there just been a death in the family? Like any of that stuff just exacerbates what's going on.
I see.
So it could be a combination of, your parents getting divorced, you have a concussion, you have the SATs coming up, and you've never faced any of this before. And it's all this multiple layers of stuff, it's never particularly simple. And if there's something below a mental health condition or addiction, or there's some struggle that is below the surface, having a concussion can bring that up and, be another thing to tackle. But I have found that diagnosis, awareness, and find the right medical team. If you don't have the right medical team, if you don't have the right medical team, find the right medical team. If you don't feel like people believe you are taking you seriously or have a systemic bias against you for whatever reason that be, and we do make assumptions. I have seen assumptions be made about women. Well, she was emotional before the concussion, or, she was a little off her rocker, and so I've seen the female ones, and we, and I have learned we didn't have many women of color in our groups. And that's been something that's really bothered me over the last couple of years. And now through Clubhouse and interacting with more people, I have been able to hear this great group on the Black community and mental health I was telling you about. I'm learning more about cultural reasons that maybe different groups don't reach out to mental health professionals. And then when they do reach out, they don't see anyone that looks like them, that understands the perspective that they're coming from. I stepped over this gap where my culture says this isn't really the thing to do, and you're not meeting me halfway and don't understand how hard it was for me to walk in the door. So
exactly.
And again, I am a white woman who has mostly had health insurance, and most of the time, wasn't in debt. And, I've seen my own personal struggles as a single mom trying to get stuff. So, put race, ethnicity, whether you just immigrated from another country, English is your first language, every different layer. So I can't speak as from an authentic perspective from that, but the stories I hear are every layer just puts it further down, and especially with an invisible illness or injury. And I think also, it's the same thing with ADHD, where it's invisible. You appear to be normal. And if your behavior is off target, then that must be some moral flaw about you.
Okay.
So if you're going to be judged from a moral flaw perspective, I don't want to wear, a brain injury or TBI on my forehead.
Right.
And I know my stepfather, and my stepfather was labeled, as learning disabled. And he felt like he sat in a room with 3 pencils for most of his educational experience, and did 1 semester of college and never went back. My mother had the experience in city schools dealing with kids that were struggling with poverty and social issues and integration. And she, so the 2 of them were terrified that I'd be labeled. They were really frightened of it. Gotcha. So I think a lot of it was kept from me. So I found this out of the 40s, and neither of them were alive to find out the answer. But I know that the fear of me being labeled was very deep for my mom.
Gotcha. Yeah, that makes sense. That makes sense. So, so just to kind of close things up, if people wanted to just understand more about concussions or more about the combination of ADHD and concussions, is there any information? I mean, we're going to talk about your information next, but is there any other information, be it books or YouTube channels or podcasts or any other resources out there for people to just read about it?
On concussions.
On concussions.
I always refer everybody to the CDC.
Okay.
The CDC has a lot of different, sports concussions, domestic violence concussions. So that was the pit bull flipping her ears, which makes this kind of flipping sound. So yeah, I always refer people to the CDC. There were people for a while in brain injury that were trying to kind of get their own spin on it, but it's just best to return. Is this, the same way we do with vaccines and COVID, it's best to go to, they put out what they feel that they can. It may not be the second of the cutting edge, but it's standardized and presented in a way. It's also in English and Spanish, and I think a couple other languages. So I really like the CDC stuff. Brainline is another organization. And the military has a lot of stuff. The VA and a lot of the military stuff is also standardized in a way and focused on return to work. Domestic violence, there's a really great one called Brain Injured and Abused. I have a resource list too on Pink Concussions. So
perfect.
Again, I think starting with the CDC and then adding in what different issues. And again, it's a new field. Every 6 months, something changes. Okay. So stay tuned.
Yeah, understood. And if they have any more questions for you specifically, can you share your website? Can you share your Instagram?
Yeah. And I'm on Pink Concussions. My phone number is there. Every social media, Instagram. We don't have TikTok, but we have Instagram, YouTube channel, Facebook, Twitter. Pink Concussions. I have I think close to 9,000 followers on Twitter, which just amazed me that there are 9,000. I think they're in 84 different countries. Nice. So it just fascinates me because all I talk about is women and brain injuries. And it's neat to now be in the ADHD space again and feel and see everybody's done the work on women and ADHD. Like, I feel like there's really nothing like it's a much more mature topic than when I last checked in 17 years ago. Y'all been doing great work.
Well, it's really interesting though. I mean, this whole ADHD direction has been very interesting to me, and I've learned so much as I was going through this journey. So yeah, it's just cool. It's just, I know people don't always think it's cool, but for me, because I have a different perspective, I started the journey with my children and then got diagnosed later. So for me, it was validation, and it just made me feel whole. So it was a very positive experience for me. And I know people struggle, and I empathize with that. So, but it's just been a very interesting journey for me. So.
Yeah. And I do think that, that labeling of our children, I can empathize with the, not wanting to stick that label on them. And I think it's up to us as advocates to really educate and inform people that I don't believe it's a disorder. I do believe it's a trait. I do believe that most of the most amazing men and women in the world had this trait.
Yeah.
So, yeah. So thanks for the time. It's very fun.
Yes. Thank you, Katherine. I look forward to working with you on Clubhouse. So
yeah, see you on Clubhouse.
absolutely.
Thank you.
Have a wonderful
Take care,
day.
Amy.
Okay.
You too.
Bye.
Bye-bye.